And that's a harder question sometimes to answer. Certainly this is not a question that I see getting raised in the standard halls of academia. I don't see this raised in political science departments or history departments around the country or beyond. I think that they're still stuck in a much more conventional mindset. But the fact is, what I try to do is analyze each of the presidencies and their relationship to the elite organizations, the infamous Bilderberg Group, CFR, Trilateral, and so forth. Is there a relationship? Well, the answer is absolutely 100% yes. Absolutely yes. Not maybe, but yes. And this is important. The kingmaker of the United States for the past half century easily has been David Rockefeller. You don't get to be president until he says, you are going to be president. Gerald Ford was a 5-time Bilderberg attendee back in the 1960s. He didn't just come out of nowhere to become the first unelected president in American history. Jimmy Carter, as probably most people in this room know, was lifted almost directly by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski and dropped into the White House. That's really the case. I mean, Jimmy Carter interviewed with them before he got the Democratic nomination. They were impressed by him. They said, yes, you're going to be our man. And Brzezinski, of course, became his national security advisor. And he's now, of course, one of the key advisors and point men for Barack Obama. Some things never change. Carter's the influence of the Trilateral Commission in the Carter administration was actually much commented on at the time. And 1980 presidential candidate Ronald Reagan made a lot of political capital out of this fact. Ronald Reagan in 1980 sounded a lot like Ron Paul did last year, believe it or not. He really did. Ronald Reagan campaigned in 1980 against the elites, campaigned against the Council on Foreign Relations, campaigned against George Herbert Walker Bush in that regard, and said, in fact, that man will never be part of my administration. Well, it so happened that Ronald Reagan's campaign manager was one William Casey, key leading CFR man and a close friend of the Rockefellers. And all of that changed, obviously, when Ronald Reagan selected Bush as his running mate, causing a number of longtime Reagan supporters to walk off the stage at the Republican nomination, in fact. A month or two after that, in September of 1980, Ronald Reagan had a pre-victory campaign meeting, a campaign party, September of 80, and seated to his right was David Rockefeller himself. So that's how it all works. I have some points even that I make on the assassination attempt of Ronald Reagan by John Hinckley Jr., son of John Hinckley Sr., who was a very close friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, very close friend. Hinckley's older brother, Scott Hinckley, that night, the night of the assassination attempt, was due to have lunch with Neil Bush, son of the vice president. Very interesting indeed. A confluence that major media really did not delve into at all. Okay, moving ahead then to other themes. Well, before I leave this, I'll just then say that the United States presidency, as I argue, the U.S. president, let me put it this way, is essentially a sales rep. And his job is to sell you really two things these days. The first thing that he's got to sell you is globalization, which is a bitter pill for many Americans to swallow. So he's got to be good at that. And then the other pill he's got to make you swallow is whatever new war comes down the pike. And they do this on behalf of international financial groups. One of the other things that I will mention before moving on is I did a brief, but I think concise analysis of the Gulf War. It's not a UFO event, per se, but it's important. It's important in order for all of us to remind ourselves that we need to take the veil away and see our power structure for what it is. And the reason is that if we are interested in what we call disclosure and openness from our government, then we need to know exactly what that government is. We can't go through our lives rerunning our fifth grade civics class version of the government in our mind. you know that version. You vote for your member of Congress. This is all on Schoolhouse Rock, if you live through that. Your member of Congress, and then how a bill becomes a law, and the checks and balances, let's not forget that, and on and on and on. That's really not our world anymore. We're in a different world, and we need to understand the true structure of power as it exists. This was an important part of what I tried to do in this book. The other aspect, we'll loosely call it under politics, would be the technological considerations. Again, asking a question, which I don't have a complete answer to this, the ours versus theirs issue. So if you see a UFO, who made it? Did we make it? Did, quote, they, end quote, make it? It's a hard issue always to resolve, at least in my own view. I try to look at this by understanding what was the state of our official technological achievements at certain periods in the history of this. What were the possible states of achievement in the black world, in the covert world? And trying to piece this together. Black budget matters and privatization of the secret also figure into my book. What is the black budget? Well, I think you all know. It's not just classified federal spending, though. I think there's a lot more that goes into what we call the black budget. I think there's a great deal of what we would all call illegal money going into black budget, into what we would call special access programs or waived special access programs or unacknowledged special access programs. There's actually a whole host of other program names that have come across me in my research. They have little to no, let's say no oversight by Congress. They have little to no oversight sometimes by their own agencies, whether it's the Navy or Army or Air Force or any of the intelligence groups. Who knows who runs some of these things? It appears that there's a lot of illegal money flowing through, whether that's narco-trafficking dollars or securities fraud, stock market fraud, flowing through our government like the blood in your veins. And by privatization of the secret, what I mean is, again, forgetting UFOs for a moment, I think it's not hard for all of us to see how government agencies, and this is not simply the US, have become completely dominated by private money. I think we can see this. And so it's also the case with the UFO secret. One of the points that I make, and some of this, not all of it, does come from a couple of sources that unfortunately I'm just not at liberty to say who these people are, but I've been given information that I think is valid, that indicates a massive runaway nature of the UFO secret in the hands of private, semi-public, but often very private interest groups. Certainly when you look at the special access program, that whole world, the few studies that have been done on it do indicate that private contractors are the dominant partner rather than DoD personnel, who function for their part primarily as gatekeepers for money to flow in. But the actual decisions are run by, whether it's Boeing or Lockheed or SAIC or Raytheon or whoever is running the program. They're the dominant ones. And it makes sense. Because think about it, if you're a Pentagon 4-star general, when you retire, who's going to hire you? Well, those companies will, at a nice cushy job making a lot of money. And it's all this revolving door that goes on. So the private industry, and it's also very much easier for keeping the secret when you privatize this. Because the information then doesn't become classified, it becomes proprietary, which is a much, much better way to keep this information from the public. And it becomes profitable, of course. If you assume, as I do, as I've come to believe, that much of this involves retrieval of acquired technologies, exotic technology, not manufactured by human hands. So then you've got this little artifact that you've got to study, and you may not be able to duplicate it right away, but you might, after 10 years, come up with some pretty nifty ideas on what you can do, and you've got a great money maker there. And so really the incentive for giving this secret up becomes less and less and less over the years. So it naturally becomes private. Of course it does. So the obvious conclusion, this is the kindergarten level conclusion of the politics portion, is that there's an active international cover-up of the core of the UFO phenomenon. There's obviously much more that I try to say regarding that. But again, If there's a single takeaway message,